The smoke from the grill was thick, the music was blasting, and my entire extended family was gathered in my parents' backyard in Willowbrook Heights for our annual summer BBQ. I had just finished setting up the entire event, coordinated the catering, arranged the seating, managed the timeline, sent all the invitations, when my father Callum looked across the patio at his business associates and laughed. "Don't mind Mira running around here," he said, gesturing dismissively in my direction as I adjusted the final centerpiece. "She's just the help, always has been, always will be." Everyone chuckled. His colleagues nodded knowingly. My aunts smiled awkwardly. I didn't flinch. I just smiled, straightened my blazer, and quietly pulled out my phone to check my messages. Because what my father didn't know was that in exactly 48 hours, one of my clients would be calling him about his job, and his entire world was about to change forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The familiar sounds of our family's annual summer BBQ filled the sprawling backyard of the Straven family estate in Willowbrook Heights. The same sounds I'd been orchestrating for the past 12 years since Mom passed away. Sizzling burgers on the industrial-grade grill, ice clinking in glasses, my cousin's children shrieking as they ran through the sprinkler system I'd set up that morning, and the low rumble of conversations between my father's business associates who always seemed to dominate these gatherings. I moved through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone who had planned every detail down to the minute. The red and white checkered tablecloths were perfectly aligned. The centerpieces I'd arranged earlier that week complemented the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the oak trees, and the catered spread from Thornfield Delicatessen was laid out exactly as I'd specified in my detailed event timeline. My father, Callum Straven, stood near the pool holding court with 3 men in polo shirts and khakis. I recognized them immediately. Marcus Brightwell from Brightwell Construction, David Chen from Pinnacle Development, and Robert Martinez from Martinez Holdings. All prominent figures in the commercial real estate development scene that had made my father wealthy over the past 2 decades. As senior project manager at Straven Development Group, Dad had built his reputation on delivering large-scale residential and commercial projects throughout the Tri-County area. His company had developed half the shopping centers and office complexes between here and the state capital. These BBQs weren't just family gatherings, they were networking events disguised as casual get-togethers, opportunities for him to strengthen relationships with subcontractors, suppliers, and potential partners. I was refilling the ice bucket, near their conversation when I heard Brightwell asking about the logistics for their upcoming Heritage District project. "Callum, I've got to hand it to you," Brightwell said, gesturing toward the perfectly organized event around them. "Everything always runs like clockwork at your place. You must have quite the event coordinator." My father chuckled, taking a long swig from his beer bottle. "Event coordinator? That's generous, Marcus." He glanced over at me as I adjusted the umbrella angle to better shade their table. "Don't mind Mira running around here. She's just the help. Always has been, always will be." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I'd learned long ago not to react visibly to my father's casual cruelty. Chen and Martinez shifted uncomfortably, but Brightwell laughed along with Dad's dismissive joke. "She does good work, though," Martinez offered, perhaps trying to soften the moment. "Oh, sure, she's useful," Dad replied, waving his hand in my direction without actually looking at me. "Good with the domestic stuff. Planning parties, running errands, keeping track of appointments. You know, typical women's work. Nothing that requires any real skill or business sense." I continued arranging the condiment station, my movements, steady and deliberate, but inside something fundamental had shifted. Not broken, shifted. Like a gear clicking into a different position after years of grinding in the wrong direction. Chen cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, Organization is actually a valuable skill in business these days. Ha! My father's laugh was sharp and dismissive. David, there's a difference between setting up a backyard BBQ and running a multi-million-dollar development company. Mira's fine at the small stuff, but she doesn't have the head for real business. Never has. That's why she's here playing hostess instead of out there making something of herself like her brother Julian. Julian, of course. My older brother, who worked as a mid-level marketing coordinator at a tech startup downtown, but somehow received more respect and recognition for his business acumen than I'd ever gotten for anything I'd accomplished. The conversation continued, but I'd stopped listening. Instead, I found myself studying my father's face as he pontificated about market trends and development opportunities. The same face that had never once asked about my actual work, my clients, or my professional achievements. The same man who had somehow convinced himself that because I chose to organize family events and help coordinate his social calendar, I must be incapable of anything more substantial. I excused myself quietly and headed toward the house, ostensibly to check on the kitchen preparations, but really to collect my thoughts. As I walked across the patio, my phone buzzed with a text message from my assistant, Dahlia. Mira, the Cromwell Industries proposal review is scheduled for Monday morning. They're specifically requesting your input on the restructuring timeline. Also, Meridian Group confirmed they want to move forward with the executive transition plan you designed. Big week ahead, I smiled to myself, slipping the phone back into the pocket of my blazer. If only Dad knew that while he was dismissing me as just the help to his small circle of local developers, I was actually the Senior Vice President of Strategic Consulting at Blackstone and Associates, one of the most prestigious corporate consulting firms in the region. For the past 8 years, I'd built a reputation for helping major corporations navigate complex organizational transitions, executive restructuring, and operational efficiency improvements. My client list included Fortune 500 companies, major healthcare systems, university networks, and yes, several prominent real estate development firms. The irony wasn't lost on me that some of the companies I consulted for were direct competitors to my father's business, or that my recommendations had influenced hiring decisions, contract awards, and strategic partnerships that affected the entire industry he operated in. But he'd never bothered to ask about my work beyond the superficial. How's the job going? Questions that he'd immediately lose interest in before I could provide any real details. In his mind, I was permanently categorized as the family helper, the reliable daughter who could be counted on to handle the logistical details of his life while he focused on real business. I stood in the kitchen, looking out the window at the party I'd orchestrated, watching my father continue his conversation with men who had no idea they were talking to someone whose professional recommendations could influence their careers. The cognitive dissonance was almost absurd. Tomorrow, I had a consultation call with the executive board of Titan Development Corporation, the largest commercial real estate firm in the state. They were considering a major restructuring of their project management division and had specifically requested my expertise in identifying leadership gaps and recommending personnel changes. Next week, I was flying to the corporate headquarters of Cromwell Industries to present a comprehensive analysis of their subsidiary operations, including detailed assessments of their various development partnerships and subcontractor relationships. The week after that, I had 3 separate meetings with executives from companies that regularly competed with Straven Development Group for major contracts. But to my father, I was just the help. I pulled out my phone again and opened my work calendar. The next few weeks were packed with high-level consulting engagements, board presentations, and strategic planning sessions. Somewhere in that schedule, I realized, lay the perfect opportunity to show my father exactly what kind of help I really was. As I returned to the party, I caught the tail end of Dad's conversation with Brightwell about an upcoming bid for a major mixed-use development project downtown. The competition's going to be fierce on this one, Brightwell was saying. Word is, Titan Development is bringing in some high-powered consultants to advise on their bid strategy. Consultants, my father scoffed. Half of them are just overpaid. College graduates who've never actually built anything. Give me practical experience over fancy degrees any day. I smiled and began clearing empty plates from their table, moving through the conversation like the invisible helper he'd always seen me as. But this time, my invisibility felt different. This time, it felt like power. Because while my father saw a dutiful daughter playing hostess, I was actually a woman who could influence the very industry dynamics he spent his days navigating. And soon, very soon, that invisible power was about to become very visible indeed. The sun was beginning to set over Willowbrook Heights, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. The party would continue for another few hours, but for me, the real event was just beginning. I had work to do. Standing in that kitchen, staring out at the party that had become a symbol of everything wrong with my relationship with my father, the memories came flooding back like scenes from a movie I'd tried to forget but could never quite escape. It hadn't always been this way, but looking back, I could trace the pattern of dismissal and diminishment back to my teenage years. Right? Around the time my mother got sick, Mom had been the one who encouraged my academic achievements, who celebrated when I graduated valedictorian from Willowbrook Heights Academy, who beamed with pride when I received a full scholarship to study business administration at the state university. She was the one who understood that my careful attention to detail and natural organizational abilities weren't just domestic skills, but indicators of analytical thinking and strategic planning capabilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But when Mom was diagnosed with ovarian cancer during my sophomore year of college, everything changed. I remember the conversation with painful clarity. Dad had called me into his home office, the same oak-paneled room where he conducted business meetings and intimidated contractors with his booming voice and aggressive negotiation tactics. "Mira, your mother's going to need more help around here," he'd said, not looking up from the stack of development plans spread across his desk. "I'm going to need you to step up and handle more of the household responsibilities." I'd nodded, of course. I loved my mother and wanted to do everything possible to make her treatment easier. "I can drive home on weekends and help with appointments. Cleaning, whatever you need." "Actually," he'd continued, finally looking at me with that calculating expression I'd come to recognize as his business face, "I think you should transfer to the community college here in town. That way you can be home full-time to help your mother and keep the household running." The suggestion had felt like a punch to the gut. Transfer from a prestigious university program to community college? Give up my scholarship, my carefully planned career trajectory, my dreams of building something meaningful beyond the boundaries of Willowbrook Heights. "Dad, I'm doing really well in my program. My professors think I have real potential for graduate school, maybe even an MBA. Can't we figure out another arrangement for Mom's care?" His expression had hardened immediately. "Mira, your mother is dying. This is about family responsibility, not your career fantasies. Julian's already established in his program, and someone needs to be here to handle things properly." Julian, who was 2 years older than me, was studying marketing at a private college 3 hours away. Somehow, his education was never in question, never something that could be interrupted for family obligations. I'd compromised, arranging my class schedule so I could drive home 3 days a week, essentially living a double life as a full-time university student and part-time family caregiver. The strain was enormous, but I was determined not to sacrifice my education. That arrangement lasted exactly 1 semester. "This isn't working, Mira," Dad had announced during Christmas break of my junior year. "Your mother needs consistent care, and I need someone I can rely on to manage the household properly. You're going to withdraw from the university and focus on what really matters." The fight that followed was the worst we'd ever had. I'd accused him of sexism, of sacrificing my future while protecting Julian's. I'd pointed out that he could afford to hire professional caregivers and housekeeping services. I'd argued that Mom herself wanted me to finish my degree. His response had been swift and brutal. If you want to continue living in this house and being part of this family, you'll do what needs to be done. If your education is more important than your dying mother, then maybe you should reconsider your priorities. The ultimatum was clear. Choose family or choose my future. There was no middle ground in Callum Straven's world, so I'd withdrawn from the university, moved back home full-time, and spent the next 18 months caring for my mother, while simultaneously becoming my father's unpaid personal assistant, event coordinator, and household manager. Mom had tried to intervene, I realize now. During her lucid moments between chemotherapy sessions, she would pull me aside and whisper urgently about not giving up on my dreams. "Promise me you'll go back to school," she'd say, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you won't let him convince you that this is all you're capable of." I'd promised. But by the time Mom died 6 months before my scheduled graduation date, returning to university felt impossible. I'd been out of academic life for too long, lost my scholarship, and Dad had made it clear that he considered the matter closed. "You've found your calling, Mira," he'd said at Mom's funeral, as relatives praised my devotion and organizational skills. "You're a natural caregiver. Not everyone is cut out for the business world, and there's no shame in that." But I wasn't ready to accept his limited vision of my capabilities. While continuing to manage the household and coordinate his social calendar, I'd secretly enrolled in night classes at the local community college, using the small inheritance. Mom had left me to pay tuition. Dad never asked about my evening commitments. As long as his dinner was ready, his shirts were pressed, and his social events were perfectly orchestrated, he didn't concern himself with how I spent my time. It took me 3 years to complete my associate degree while maintaining the household, and another 2 years to finish my bachelor's degree through an accelerated evening program. I'd graduated summa cum laude in business administration, but when I'd mentioned the achievement at dinner, Dad had barely looked up from his newspaper. "That's nice, honey. Did you remember to confirm my tea time for Saturday?" The pattern had been established and reinforced over years. My academic achievements were invisible. My professional ambitions were irrelevant. My analytical capabilities were ignored. But my ability to coordinate his calendar, organize his parties, and manage his domestic life was not only acknowledged, but expected. When I'd landed my first job at a small consulting firm downtown, he'd assumed it was secretarial work. When I'd been promoted to senior consultant within 18 months, he'd credited my success to my people skills and attention to detail, the same condescending compliments he'd used to describe a particularly efficient housekeeper. When I'd been recruited by Blackstone and Associates and offered a substantial salary increase and senior-level position, he'd somehow convinced himself that I'd gotten the job because the company needed someone good at organizing things. The most infuriating part was how he'd incorporated my professional success into his own narrative of family stability. At social gatherings, he'd mentioned that I had a little job downtown that kept me busy, but always in the context of how well the family was doing overall. My career became another household amenity, like the landscaping or the imported Italian tile in his master bathroom. Even as my client list grew to include major corporations, even as my professional reputation spread throughout the business community, even as my income eventually surpassed his own, he continued to see me through the lens he'd constructed during those difficult years when Mom was sick. I was the reliable daughter, the one who could be counted on to handle logistics, the one who made his life easier by taking care of all the details he couldn't be bothered with, the help. The tragic irony was that many of the skills that made me successful in corporate consulting, strategic thinking, complex project coordination, stakeholder management, crisis navigation, were skills I'd developed while managing our household during Mom's illness and death. But instead of recognizing those capabilities as transferable professional assets, Dad had categorized them as purely domestic accomplishments. Julian, meanwhile, had graduated with mediocre grades, landed an entry-level marketing position through one of Dad's connections, and was regularly praised for his business sense and professional potential. His modest achievements were celebrated, analyzed, and held up as examples of the Straven family's commitment to success. My professional accomplishments were footnotes in the story of how well Dad had raised his children despite the tragic loss of his wife. Standing in that kitchen, watching him diminish me in front of his business associates for the 1,000th time, I finally understood that this pattern would never change through gradual demonstration of competence or quiet achievement. He had too much invested in his perception of me to ever voluntarily revise his understanding of who I was and what I was capable of. But that didn't mean the pattern couldn't be broken. It just meant that I would have to be the one to break it. That night, long after the last guest had left and the catering dishes had been returned to their designated containers, I sat in my childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling and processing what had happened at the BBQ. The room hadn't changed much since high school. Same pale yellow walls Mom had helped me paint, same white furniture set she'd bought for my 16th birthday, same corkboard covered with academic achievement certificates and college acceptance, letters that Dad had never bothered to look at closely enough to understand their significance. But I had changed, dramatically. The woman lying in that twin bed was not the uncertain teenager who'd been forced to abandon her university dreams, nor the grief-stricken young adult who'd allowed her father to define the boundaries of her capabilities. I was 31 years old, held a senior executive position at one of the region's most respected consulting firms, managed a 7-figure book of business, and regularly advised Fortune 500 companies on strategic decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. Yet somehow in this house, surrounded by the physical artifacts of my past, I still felt like the invisible daughter whose primary value was her ability to coordinate party logistics and anticipate her father's needs. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. I reached for my laptop and opened my work files, scrolling through the client roster that represented 8 years of professional growth and achievement. The list read like a directory of major corporations and influential organizations: Meridian Healthcare System, Cromwell Industries, Titan Development Corporation, Pinnacle Financial Group, North Shore University Medical Center. Each client relationship represented months or years of complex consulting engagements, strategic planning sessions, organizational assessments, and implementation oversight. Each project had required me to navigate intricate corporate politics, analyze complex operational challenges, and develop comprehensive solutions that balanced multiple stakeholder interests. This wasn't helping with the small stuff, as Dad had described my capabilities earlier that evening. This was high-level strategic consulting that required exactly the kind of analytical thinking and business acumen he claimed I didn't possess. But the most significant realization wasn't about my professional accomplishments. It was about power. Real. Power in the business world isn't always obvious or dramatic. It doesn't always come with corner offices or public recognition. Sometimes, the most substantial influence operates behind the scenes, through relationships, recommendations, and strategic insights that shape major decisions without fanfare or attribution. I thought about my upcoming consultation with Titan Development Corporation, the largest commercial real estate firm in the state and Straven Development Group's primary competitor for major contracts. Their executive board had specifically requested my expertise in evaluating their project management structure and identifying leadership gaps that might be affecting their competitive performance. I thought about my ongoing relationship with Cromwell Industries, whose subsidiary operations included several companies that regularly competed with Dad's firm for subcontracting work and supplier relationships. I thought about my work with Pinnacle Financial Group, which managed commercial, lending and development financing for most of the major real estate projects in our market area. I thought about the detailed industry knowledge I'd accumulated over years of consulting with companies throughout the commercial development sector, knowledge that included insights into market trends, competitive strategies, regulatory challenges, and emerging opportunities that could significantly impact any individual firm's success. For the first time, I began to consider my professional network not as a separate sphere of accomplishment, but as a potential source of leverage in my personal situation. The thought was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. I'd spent so many years compartmentalizing my professional success, keeping it separate from family dynamics to avoid conflict and preserve relationships. But what if that separation was actually enabling the very pattern of dismissal and disrespect I was trying to escape? What if the solution wasn't to gradually prove my competence within the existing family dynamic, but to fundamentally alter the power balance by making my professional influence visible and undeniable? I opened my calendar and began reviewing the next month's consulting engagements. Board presentations, strategic planning sessions, executive assessments, competitive analyses, a comprehensive schedule of activities that put me in direct contact with decision-makers throughout the business community Dad operated in. Somewhere in that schedule, I realized, was the opportunity to demonstrate exactly what kind of help I really provided to my clients. But this wouldn't be about revenge or humiliation. It would be about truth. The truth about my professional capabilities, my industry influence, and my strategic value to organizations that took me seriously as a business advisor rather than dismissing me as domestic staff. I thought about Mom's final request during her last lucid conversation before the cancer took her speech away. She'd pulled me close and whispered, "Don't let him make you smaller than you are, Mira. Promise me you'll show the world who you really are." I'd promised then, but I'd never fully delivered on that commitment. I'd achieved professional success, but I'd allowed it to remain invisible to the people who mattered most. I'd built a career, but I'd kept it separate from my identity within the family that had shaped me. That separation had been a survival strategy, a way to avoid conflict and maintain relationships while pursuing my own goals. But it had also been a trap, allowing the family narrative about my limitations to persist unchanged despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. Wasn't going to continue living in two separate worlds, the professional sphere where I was respected as a strategic advisor, and the family sphere where I was dismissed as useful but unambitious help. It was time to merge those worlds, to bring my professional identity home, and to force a confrontation between the reality of my capabilities and the fiction of my father's expectations. I pulled out my phone and began typing a text message to Dahlia, my assistant. "I need you to research the background and current client relationships for 3 companies: Brightwell Construction, Pinnacle Development, and Martinez Holdings. I specifically want to know if any of our current or potential clients have business relationships with these firms, including contracts, partnerships, or competitive dynamics. Also, please compile a list of all our clients in the commercial real estate development sector and their major competitors. I have a strategic project in mind." I paused before hitting send, considering the implications of what I was about to set in motion. This wasn't just about proving a point or winning an argument. This was about fundamentally changing the family dynamic that had defined and limited me for over a decade. Success would mean that Dad could never again dismiss my professional capabilities or reduce my value to domestic usefulness. But it would also mean that our relationship, whatever its flaws and limitations, would be permanently altered. There would be no going back to the comfortable fiction that I was just the helpful daughter who happened to have a little job downtown. I hit send. Then, I closed my laptop, turned off the light, and lay back against the pillows that still smelled faintly of the fabric softener I'd been buying and using to maintain this household for the past 12 years. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of showing my father, and everyone else, exactly who Mira Straven really was. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp efficiency I'd learned to appreciate during my years of managing complex consulting projects. By 6 a.m., I was already in my downtown office at Blackstone and Associates, reviewing the research Dahlia had compiled over the weekend. The information was even more comprehensive than I'd hoped. Brightwell Construction, one of the companies whose owner had been present during Dad's dismissive comments at the BBQ, was currently competing for a major subcontracting opportunity with Meridian Healthcare System, one of my longest-standing clients. The healthcare system was planning a $200 million expansion of their suburban campus, and they'd specifically requested my input on vendor selection and project management oversight. Pinnacle Development, represented by David Chen at the BBQ, had been pursuing a joint venture opportunity with Cromwell Industries for over 8 months. Cromwell Industries had hired me 6 months ago to conduct a comprehensive assessment of their partnership strategies and potential collaboration opportunities. My recommendation would carry significant weight in their decision-making process. Most significantly, Martinez Holdings was owned by Robert Martinez, whose company had recently submitted a proposal to manage several major development projects for Titan Development Corporation. As their strategic consultant, I would be directly involved in evaluating competing proposals and making recommendations about vendor selection and project partnerships. The interconnected nature of business relationships in our regional market had created a web of potential influence points that I'd never fully appreciated. My professional network wasn't just separate from Dad's business world, it was deeply embedded within it. But the most interesting discovery was something Dahlia had uncovered through her research into Straven Development Group's current projects and competitive position. Dad's company was facing some significant challenges that he'd managed to keep relatively quiet within industry circles, but that were visible to someone with access to comprehensive market analysis and financial data. 3 of their major projects from the previous year had experienced cost overruns and completion delays that had strained relationships with key clients. 2 of their long-term suppliers had shifted their primary partnerships to other development firms. Their market share in the commercial development sector had declined by nearly 15% over the past 18 months, largely due to increased competition from more efficiently managed companies. Most importantly, Straven Development Group was currently competing for the largest contract in their company's history, a mixed-use development project downtown that could either revitalize their market position or, if lost, potentially threaten their long-term viability as a major player in the regional development market. The decision on that contract would be made by a consortium of investors and municipal planning officials, several of whom regularly consulted with firms like Blackstone and Associates when evaluating major development proposals. I spent the morning reviewing my client files and mapping out the potential intersection points between my consulting work and Dad's business interests. The opportunities for demonstrating my professional influence were more numerous and more significant than I'd initially realized. But this wouldn't be about sabotage or manipulation. It would be about authentic professional excellence and transparent business relationships. I would simply allow my existing client commitments and consulting responsibilities to proceed naturally, without the artificial separation I'd maintained between my professional identity and my family relationships. My first call was to Dr. Patricia Hawkins, Chief Administrative Officer at Meridian Healthcare System. Patricia, I wanted to follow up on our discussion about subcontractor evaluation for the campus expansion project. I've been reviewing the submitted proposals, and I have some concerns about one of the companies under consideration. Which company, Mira? Brightwell Construction. Their proposal is competitive on price, but I've identified some potential risks in their project management approach and recent performance history that I think we should discuss before making a final decision. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. By the end, Dr. Hawkins had agreed to schedule an additional review meeting with the selection committee, with my analysis serving as the basis for their discussion. My second call was to James Morrison, Senior Vice President at Cromwell Industries. James, I wanted to update you on my assessment of potential partnership opportunities. Based on my analysis of market position, operational efficiency, and strategic alignment, I have some recommendations about which development firms would be the strongest collaborative partners for your expansion initiatives. That conversation resulted in a request for a comprehensive written report comparing the operational capabilities and strategic value of various potential partners, including Pinnacle Development. My third call was to Sandra Walsh, Executive Director of Strategic Planning at Titan Development Corporation. Sandra, I'm finalizing my recommendations for your vendor evaluation process. I want to make sure you have a complete analysis of each proposed partner's track record, financial stability, and operational capacity before your board meeting next week. Each conversation was professional, ethical, and directly related to existing consulting commitments. I wasn't creating opportunities to undermine Dad's competitors. I was simply executing my professional responsibilities with the same thoroughness and strategic insight that had built my reputation as a trusted advisor, but I was also, for the first time, allowing those professional relationships to operate without artificial boundaries designed to protect family dynamics. The next step was more delicate. I called my brother Julian at his marketing firm downtown. "Hey, Julian, I need to ask you something. Are you planning to attend Dad's birthday party next month?" "Of course. Why?" "I'm thinking about making it a more significant event this year. Maybe inviting some of his business associates, turning it into a networking opportunity for him. I know he's been working on some major projects lately, and it might be helpful for him to strengthen those relationships in a social setting." Julian was immediately enthusiastic. Dad's 55th birthday was always a family-only affair, usually just dinner at an expensive restaurant. The prospect of turning it into a business networking event appealed to Julian's marketing instincts. "That's a great idea, Mira. He'd probably love the opportunity to showcase his success to his professional contacts. Do you want me to help with the planning?" "Actually, I was thinking this might be a good opportunity for me to coordinate something more sophisticated than our usual family gatherings. I've been doing a lot of event management in my consulting work lately, and I'd like to apply those skills to something special for Dad." Julian agreed immediately, probably relieved to avoid the logistical work of party planning. The final call was the most important. "Dad, I had an idea about your birthday party this year. What would you think about making it a professional networking event? Inviting some of your business contacts? Maybe some potential clients or partners? I could coordinate everything to make sure it reflects well on Straven Development Group." His response was predictably patronizing. "That's very thoughtful, Mira, but business entertaining is pretty complex. It's not like organizing a family barbecue." "I know, Dad. That's actually something I've been learning about through my work downtown. I've been coordinating client events and professional gatherings as part of my consulting responsibilities, and I think I could apply those skills to something special for your birthday." He agreed, probably assuming that my consulting work involved administrative coordination rather than strategic business advisory services. Over the next 2 weeks, I began planning what would be the most sophisticated professional event I'd ever coordinated, not because of the logistical complexity, but because of the strategic significance. The guest list would include decision-makers from every major company in Dad's professional network, including several of my own clients who had never realized the connection between Mira Straven, Senior Vice President at Blackstone & Associates, and Callum Straven's daughter. The timing would coincide with several major business decisions that would directly impact Dad's company and his professional relationships. And for the first time in my adult life, I would be present at a social gathering not as the invisible coordinator working behind the scenes, but as a respected professional with my own identity, relationships, and influence. The party was still 3 weeks away, but the real event, the collision between my professional identity and my family role, had already begun. 2 weeks into my strategic campaign, the phone calls began. The first came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office. Dad's voice on my cell phone carried a tone I'd rarely heard before, uncertainty mixed with confusion. "Mira, I need to ask you something. Do you know anyone at Meridian Healthcare System?" I paused, considering my response carefully. Why do you ask? Well, Marcus Brightwell just called me. Apparently, they decided not to move forward with his company for their expansion project. He said the decision came after some kind of additional review that raised concerns about his operational capacity. He was wondering if I had any insight into what might have changed, since we were both at the BBQ together a couple of weeks ago. That's unfortunate, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. I imagine healthcare organizations have very strict standards for their construction partners. The thing is, Marcus seemed to think there might have been some kind of inside information or influence that affected their decision. He couldn't figure out why they suddenly had concerns about his company's track record when his initial proposal had been well received. I could hear the wheels turning in Dad's mind, trying to connect dots that he couldn't quite see clearly yet. Did he mention what kind of concerns they raised? Something about project management methodologies and recent performance metrics. Pretty detailed stuff, apparently. Marcus said it sounded like someone with serious industry knowledge had done a comprehensive analysis of his company's operations. Well, healthcare systems probably have access to sophisticated consulting resources for major projects like that. Yeah, probably. Dad's voice carried a note of dismissal, but also lingering puzzlement. Anyway, I told him these things happen in business. Competition is tough these days. The conversation ended, but I knew it was just the beginning. The second call came 3 days later, this time in the evening while I was at home reviewing client files. Mira, something strange happened today. David Chen called me about a potential partnership opportunity he'd been pursuing with Cromwell Industries. Apparently, they've decided to go in a different direction after receiving some kind of strategic assessment about partnership priorities. This time, Dad's tone carried more concern and less confusion. David said the feedback was very specific about operational efficiency and strategic alignment issues. He couldn't understand how Cromwell suddenly had such detailed insight into his company's internal processes and competitive positioning. I set down my files and gave Dad my full attention. What kind of insight? Detailed analysis of project timelines, client satisfaction metrics, market positioning relative to competitors. Stuff that would require pretty sophisticated business intelligence to compile and analyze. Maybe Cromwell hired a consulting firm to help with their partnership evaluation? That's what David thought. But here's the weird part. When he asked Cromwell's executives about their consulting process, they mentioned working with Blackstone and Associates downtown. Isn't that where you work? My heart rate accelerated, but I kept my voice steady. Yes, I work for Blackstone and Associates. Small world, I guess. Do you know anything about their work with Cromwell Industries? This was the moment I'd been anticipating and preparing for. The point where my professional identity would begin to intersect visibly with Dad's business world. I can't discuss specific client relationships, Dad, but Blackstone and Associates does work with a lot of major corporations in the region. Right, of course. Client confidentiality and all that. But I could hear the gears turning more rapidly now. It just seems like a lot of coincidences lately. First Marcus, now David. The third call came exactly 1 week later, and this time Dad's voice carried unmistakable anxiety. Mira, I need to talk to you about something serious. Robert Martinez called me this morning. Titan Development Corporation has decided not to move forward with Martinez Holdings for their major project partnerships. They cited concerns about strategic fit and operational capacity that apparently came up during some kind of comprehensive vendor evaluation process. I waited, knowing what was coming next. All three of them, Marcus, David, and Robert, have experienced these sudden reversals after what sounds like very detailed professional assessments of their companies, and all three assessments seem to have connections to companies that work with Blackstone and Associates. That does sound like quite a coincidence. Mira. Dad's voice was serious now, stripped of its usual casual confidence. What exactly do you do at Blackstone and Associates? This was the question I'd been waiting for him to ask for 8 years. The question he'd never bothered to ask despite my professional success, my salary increases, my growing reputation within the business community. I'm a senior vice president, Dad. I head their strategic consulting division. Silence on the other end of the phone. Strategic consulting means I advise major corporations on organizational structure, operational efficiency, competitive positioning, and vendor relationships. My clients include healthcare systems, financial institutions, development corporations, and other organizations that need expert analysis of complex business challenges. More silence. The companies you mentioned, Meridian Healthcare, Cromwell Industries, Titan Development Corporation, they're all clients of mine. I provide strategic recommendations that help them make informed decisions about partnerships, contracts, and operational priorities. When Dad finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller somehow. You mean you actually influenced those decisions? You're the consultant they were talking about? I provided professional analysis based on objective criteria and industry standards. The same kind of strategic consulting I've been doing for the past 8 years. 8 years? The disbelief in his voice was palpable. You've been doing this level of consulting work for 8 years and you never told me? I tried to tell you, Dad. Every time you asked about my work, I explained what I did, but you never seemed interested in the details. You always assumed it was administrative or clerical work. Another long silence. Mira, do you understand what this means for my business? Marcus, David, and Robert are all major players in our market. If word gets around that they've been eliminated from significant opportunities because of concerns raised by someone connected to our family. Connected to our family? I interrupted. Dad, I'm not connected to our family in my professional capacity. I'm a senior executive at a respected consulting firm. My client relationships exist independently of our family connections. But people will think I somehow influenced these decisions, or that there's some kind of conflict of interest, or that I'm using family connections to undermine my competitors. The irony was stunning. Dad was worried that people might think he had influence over my professional decisions, when the reality was that he'd spent years refusing to acknowledge that my professional decisions existed at all. Actually, Dad, I don't think that's going to be the primary concern. What do you mean? I mean that when people in your industry realize that Mira Straven from Blackstone and Associates is your daughter, the same daughter you've been describing as just the help at social gatherings, they're going to have some very different questions about your judgment and business acumen. The silence that followed was longer and more complete than any of the previous pauses in our conversation. When Dad finally spoke again, his voice carried a note I'd never heard before. Something between respect and fear. Mira, we need to talk. In person. Can you come over tonight? Actually, Dad, I have a client dinner tonight with the executive board of Northern Trust Financial. They're considering some major changes to their commercial lending practices that could affect development financing throughout the region. Another pause. But I'm free tomorrow evening. We can talk then. After I hung up, I sat in my home office looking at the family photo on my desk. The last picture we'd taken together before Mom died. All of us smiling at some long-forgotten celebration. Tomorrow, I realized, that photo would represent the end of one era and the beginning of another. Because after tomorrow's conversation, Dad would never again be able to pretend that I was just the help. The question was, what kind of relationship would we have instead? The conversation with Dad never happened as scheduled. When I arrived at the Straven family estate the following evening, I found a note taped to the front door. Mira, had to fly to Atlanta for emergency client meeting. We'll talk when I get back. Dad. I stood there holding the note, realizing that even in crisis, his first instinct was avoidance rather than direct confrontation. But for the first time in my adult life, his evasion didn't leave me feeling dismissed or frustrated. Instead, it felt like liberation. Because while Dad was in Atlanta trying to manage the professional fallout from his years of underestimating, his own daughter, I was about to experience the most transformative week of my career. The next morning, I received a call from Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, president of the Regional Business Council, an organization that represented over 400 major corporations throughout the tri-state area. Ms. Straven, I hope you'll forgive the direct approach, but I've been hearing remarkable things about your consulting work from several of our member organizations. Meridian Healthcare, Cromwell Industries, and Titan Development have all specifically mentioned the exceptional strategic insight you've provided during some critical business decisions. I settled back in my office chair, intrigued by where this conversation might lead. I'm grateful for their confidence in my work, Dr. Morrison. The reason I'm calling is that we're organizing our annual Leadership Excellence Conference next month, and we're looking for a keynote speaker who can address the evolving landscape of strategic business consulting. Based on the feedback I've received, I believe you would be the perfect presenter to discuss how sophisticated analytical approaches are reshaping decision-making in major corporations. A keynote address to 400 business leaders, the kind of professional recognition that most consultants spend decades working toward. I'd be honored to participate, Dr. Morrison. Excellent. The conference attracts executive-level attendance from most of the major companies in our region, including development firms, healthcare systems, financial institutions, and technology corporations. It's exactly the audience that would benefit from understanding how strategic consulting can enhance their competitive positioning. After we finalized the details, I sat in my office contemplating the significance of what had just happened. In one phone call, I'd been invited to establish myself as a thought leader within the same business community where Dad had spent 20 years building his reputation. But the real transformation wasn't happening in conference rooms or client presentations. It was happening in the relationships I was building with people who understood and respected my professional capabilities. That afternoon, I received an email from Sarah Chen, a junior consultant at a competing firm downtown. She'd heard about my work through industry contacts and was requesting a mentorship meeting. Ms. Straven, I'm a recent MBA graduate working in corporate consulting, and I'm struggling to establish credibility with clients who seem to assume that young women don't have the analytical skills for strategic advisory work. Several people have mentioned that you've built an exceptional reputation in this field, and I was hoping you might be willing to share some insights about navigating these professional challenges. I immediately scheduled a coffee meeting with Sarah for the following week. During our conversation at a downtown cafe, she shared experiences that were painfully familiar. Clients who directed technical questions to her male colleagues despite her superior qualifications, family members who assumed her success was due to luck rather than competence, professional environments where her analytical contributions were attributed to attention to detail rather than strategic thinking. The most frustrating part, Sarah explained, is that I know I'm good at this work. My analyses are thorough, my recommendations are sound, and my clients achieve measurable improvements. But I feel like I'm constantly fighting to be taken seriously as a business strategist, rather than just someone who's good at organizing information. I recognized my own journey and her struggles, but I also realized how much my perspective had evolved over the past few weeks. Sarah, can I share something with you that I wish someone had told me years ago? She nodded eagerly. Your professional competence doesn't require anyone else's permission or recognition to be valid. The work speaks for itself. The results speak for themselves. And eventually the people who matter will recognize the value you provide, regardless of their initial assumptions. But what about the people who refuse to see it? What about the clients or colleagues or even family members who insist on underestimating your capabilities? I smiled, thinking about the conversation I'd been avoiding with Dad for the past 3 days. You stop trying to prove yourself to them, and you start building relationships with people who already understand what you're capable of. The energy you spend fighting for recognition from people who are determined not to see you is energy that could be invested in advancing your career with people who appreciate your contributions. That conversation led to another, and then another. Word spread through the professional women's networks downtown that I was available for mentoring discussions, and suddenly my calendar was filled with coffee meetings, lunch consultations, and evening phone calls with women who were navigating similar challenges in male-dominated industries. Each conversation reinforced my understanding of how my own professional journey had evolved. I'd spent years trying to prove my competence to people who had psychological investments in seeing me as less capable. But I'd also built a client base of organizations that valued my strategic insight precisely because they evaluated me based on results rather than preconceptions. The mentoring relationships became increasingly fulfilling as I watched other women develop confidence in their professional abilities and establish themselves as respected experts in their fields. But the most significant transformation wasn't in my relationship with other people. It was in my relationship with my own professional identity. For years, I'd maintained artificial separation between my work success and my personal relationships, partly to avoid conflict, but also because I'd internalized some of Dad's assumptions about the legitimacy of my achievements. On some level, I'd been protecting my professional identity by keeping it isolated from family dynamics, where it might be challenged or diminished. But the events of the past few weeks had forced me to integrate those separate aspects of my life, and the result was a much more authentic and confident sense of who I was and what I was capable of. The following week, I received a call from Jennifer Walsh, senior editor at Regional Business Journal, the most widely read business publication in our market area. Ms. Straven, we're developing a special issue on innovative approaches to strategic consulting, and we'd like to feature your work with several major regional corporations. Based on our interviews with executives at Meridian Healthcare, Cromwell, Industries, and Titan Development, it's clear that your analytical methodologies are having significant impact on how these organizations approach complex business decisions. The article, published 2 weeks later, included a full-page profile with professional photographs and detailed discussion of my consulting philosophy and client outcomes. The headline read, Strategic Vision: How Mira is Reshaping Corporate Decision-Making in the Regional Market. I bought 10 copies and placed one on my desk, not out of vanity, but as a tangible reminder of how far I'd traveled from the uncertain young woman who'd been convinced to abandon her university education to manage household responsibilities. The professional recognition created a momentum that seemed to accelerate every aspect of my career. Speaking invitations, consulting opportunities, board appointments, and leadership positions in professional organizations began arriving regularly. But the most meaningful transformation was personal rather than professional. I began each day with a sense of clarity about my own value and capabilities that didn't require external validation to sustain. I approached client relationships with confidence in my analytical skills and strategic insight. I participated in industry discussions as a peer rather than someone seeking acceptance or approval. Most importantly, I stopped compartmentalizing my success. When colleagues asked about my background, I described my education, my career progression, and my professional achievements without the apologetic qualifications I'd used for years. When family members made dismissive comments about my work, I corrected their misunderstandings directly rather than accepting their limitations as accurate assessments of my capabilities. The change was noticed immediately by everyone in my professional network. Mira, I don't know what's different, but you seem much more confident lately, commented Patricia Hawkins during our monthly consultation meeting at Meridian Healthcare. Your presentations have always been excellent, but there's something more authoritative about how you engage with our board discussions now. I think I've finally stopped second-guessing my own expertise, I replied honestly. Well, whatever the change is, it's working. The board specifically requested that we expand our consulting relationship with your firm, and they want you personally assigned to all our major strategic initiatives going forward. Similar feedback came from multiple clients over the following weeks. My professional relationships deepened as I engaged more authentically and confidently in strategic discussions. My recommendations carried more weight because I presented them with complete conviction in their validity rather than tentative suggestions requiring approval or confirmation. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I handled family interactions. When Julian called to discuss Dad's birthday party planning, I approached the conversation as a professional event coordinator rather than a dutiful daughter trying to please everyone. "Julian, I've been thinking about the guest list for Dad's party. Instead of just inviting his current business associates, what if we included some of the broader business community? People who could expand his professional network and potentially create new opportunities for Straven Development Group?" "That sounds great, but how would we identify those people?" "Well, through my consulting work, I've developed relationships with executives throughout the regional business community. I could invite some of my professional contacts who might be interested in meeting Dad and learning more about his company's capabilities." "You have those kinds of professional contacts?" I paused, realizing that Julian, like Dad, had never fully understood the scope of my career or the level of influence I'd developed within the business community. "Julian, I'm a senior vice president at one of the most respected consulting firms in the region. My clients include most of the major corporations in our market area. Of course, I have professional contacts who would be appropriate guests for a high-level business networking event." The silence on the other end of the phone was telling. "I guess I never really understood what your job involved," he said finally. "That's okay. But this party is going to be different from our usual family gatherings. It's going to be a professional event that showcases Dad's company within the broader business community, and I'm going to coordinate it as a business professional, not as the family helper." When I hung up, I realized that conversation had marked another significant shift in family dynamics. I was no longer accepting or accommodating other people's limited understanding of my capabilities. Instead, I was establishing my professional identity as the baseline for how I engaged with everyone in my life, including family members who had known me before I'd developed that identity. 3 days later, Dad finally returned from Atlanta. His first call was to my office, not to my personal phone. "Mira, this is Callum Straven calling for Mira Straven." The formality was striking and somehow appropriate. "Hello, Dad. I think we need to have that conversation now, but I want to meet at your office if that's okay. I want to see where you work and understand what you do." For the first time in my adult life, my father was requesting permission to enter my professional world rather than expecting me to accommodate his schedule and preferences within the family context he controlled. "Of course, Dad. When works for your schedule?" "Actually, when works for yours? I realize I don't know much about your professional commitments, and I don't want to interfere with your client responsibilities." As I scheduled the meeting for the following afternoon, I understood that the transformation wasn't just in how I saw myself. It was in how everyone else was beginning to see me too. The next afternoon, I watched from my corner office window as Dad's silver Mercedes pulled into the parking garage of the Blackstone and Associates building downtown. It was a 40-story glass tower that housed some of the region's most prestigious law firms, financial institutions, and consulting companies, the kind of impressive corporate environment he'd spent his career trying to gain access to for networking and business development purposes. I'd chosen to wear my navy blue Armani suit, the one I'd purchased after landing the Titan Development Consulting contract. Professional, authoritative, expensive. The kind of outfit that communicated serious business credentials without saying a word. Dahlia buzzed my intercom. "Ms. Straven, your 3 o'clock appointment is here. Please show Mr. Straven to the conference room. I'll be right there." I gathered my client portfolios, business awards, and the recent Regional Business Journal article featuring my work. Not as props, but as tangible evidence of the professional reality Dad had never bothered to investigate. When I entered the conference room, Dad was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city skyline. He turned when he heard the door, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Uncertainty mixed with what looked almost like nervousness. "Mira," He extended his hand for a formal handshake. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me here." I shook his hand and gestured toward the polished conference table surrounded by leather chairs. "Please have a seat. Can I offer you coffee or water?" "Coffee would be great." I pressed the intercom button. "Dahlia, could you bring 2 coffees to conference room A, please?" Dad looked around the room, taking in the mahogany furniture, the original artwork on the walls, the technology integrated into the table for client presentations. "This is quite impressive, Mira. Very professional." "Thank you. This is where I conduct most of my client meetings and strategic planning sessions." Dahlia entered with our coffee service on a silver tray, the kind of attention to detail that impressed corporate executives and reinforced the premium positioning of our consulting services. "Thank you, Dahlia. Please hold my calls for the next hour." "Of course, Mrs. Straven." After she left, Dad and I sat across from each other at the conference table where I'd negotiated million-dollar consulting contracts and presented strategic recommendations to Fortune 500 executives. "Dad, you said you wanted to understand what I do here. Let me show you." I opened my portfolio and spread out materials that represented 8 years of professional development, client testimonials, project summaries, industry recognition, speaking, engagements, board appointments. I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategic Consulting. I lead a team of 12 analysts and consultants who provide advisory services to major corporations throughout the region. Our typical engagements involve organizational restructuring, competitive analysis, market positioning, and operational optimization. Dad picked up the Regional Business Journal article and read the headline aloud. Strategic Vision: How Mira Straven is Reshaping Corporate Decision-Making in the Regional Market. He looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mira, I had no idea. I mean, I knew you worked here, but I thought it was more administrative work, maybe some project coordination." "I tried to explain my work to you many times over the years, Dad, but you never seemed interested in the details." I realize that now. He set down the article and leaned back in his chair. I also realized that my comments at the BBQ weren't just inappropriate. They were completely wrong. And apparently they were overheard by people who know exactly what your professional capabilities are. I waited for him to continue. "Marcus Brightwell called me yesterday from Atlanta. He'd been asking around the industry about what happened with his Meridian healthcare contract, and someone told him that Mira Straven at Blackstone and Associates was the consultant who raised concerns about his company's operational capacity." Marcus specifically asked someone about me? When he realized that Mira Straven was my daughter, the same daughter I'd dismissed as just the help at the BBQ, he wanted to understand how that situation might have influenced his business opportunities. I felt a flash of anger. "Dad, my professional recommendations are based on objective analysis of company performance and operational capabilities. They have nothing to do with family relationships or personal interactions." "I know that now. But Marcus doesn't know you professionally, so he's trying to understand the connection. And apparently, word is spreading through the business community that Callum Straven was publicly dismissive of his own daughter, who turns out to be one of the most influential business consultants in the regional market." The implications were becoming clear. Dad wasn't just dealing with the professional consequences of my client recommendations. He was dealing with the reputational consequences of having publicly underestimated someone whose professional opinion carried significant weight in his industry. What exactly are people saying? That I either don't understand my own daughter's professional achievements, which raises questions about my business judgment, or that I deliberately diminish her accomplishments, which raises questions about my character and leadership style. He paused and looked directly at me. Either way, it doesn't reflect well on my credibility as a business leader. And what do you think, Dad? Do you think you don't understand my professional achievements, or do you think you've been deliberately diminishing them? The question hung in the air between us. "I think," he said slowly, "that I've been so invested in seeing you as my little girl, who needed my protection and guidance, that I never allowed myself to recognize that you'd become an accomplished professional who didn't need either. That's part of it. But there's something else, isn't there? He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. What do you mean? I mean that it was easier to see me as someone who was good at domestic tasks and administrative work than to acknowledge that I might be as professionally capable as Julian. Or as professionally successful as you are. The silence stretched longer this time. You're right, he said finally. And I think the reason it was easier was because acknowledging your professional success would have meant acknowledging that I'd made a mistake when I convinced you to leave university to take care of your mother and manage the household. This was the conversation we'd never had, the acknowledgement that had been waiting between us for over a decade. Dad, I don't regret the time I spent taking care of Mom. But I do regret that you never recognized it as a choice I made rather than a limitation I accepted. And I regret that I never saw your capabilities clearly enough to understand that you were capable of much more than I was asking of you. I looked across the conference table at my father, seeing him perhaps for the first time as a flawed person trying to navigate a situation he'd never anticipated, rather than as an authority figure whose approval I needed to earn. The question now is, what kind of relationship do we have going forward? I'd like it to be a relationship between two business professionals who respect each other's capabilities and achievements, and who also happen to be family. That would be a very different relationship than we've had before. I know, but I think it's the relationship we should have had all along. I closed my portfolio and looked at my father. Really looked at him. For the first time in years without the filter of seeking approval or avoiding disappointment. Dad, I'm planning your birthday party as a professional networking event. My clients from throughout the regional business community will be there. You'll be introduced to them as my father, and I'll be present as Mira from Blackstone and Associates, not as your helpful daughter. I understand. It's going to be very different from our usual family gatherings. I'm looking forward to it. As Dad prepared to leave, he paused at the conference room door. Mira, I have one more question. What's that? Are you accepting new clients? Because I think Straven Development Group could benefit from some strategic consulting advice. I smiled, realizing that this was his way of asking to enter my professional world rather than expecting me to remain in his domestic sphere. I'll have Dahlia send you our standard client information package. You can review our services and fee structure and let us know if you'd like to schedule an initial consultation. I'll look forward to receiving it. After he left, I sat alone in the conference room looking out at the city skyline, understanding that everything had just changed between us. But unlike the uncertain changes of the past, this felt like a change I could control and shape, according to my own professional standards and personal boundaries. For the first time in my adult life, I wouldn't be performing a role in someone else's expectation of who I should be. I would simply be who I actually was. 3 weeks later, I stood in the elegantly appointed ballroom of the Grandview Country Club, watching the final preparations for what would become the most significant professional networking event of my father's career. The guest list read like a directory of regional business leadership. Executives from Meridian Healthcare System, Cromwell Industries, Titan Development Corporation, Northern Trust Financial, and dozens of other major corporations I'd worked with over the years. These weren't just Dad's usual subcontractor relationships and supplier connections. These were the decision-makers who shaped market trends and influenced major business opportunities throughout the tri-state area. I'd spent 2 weeks personally calling each invitee, not as Callum Straven's helpful daughter organizing a family party, but as Mira Straven from Blackstone and Associates, inviting respected colleagues to meet one of the region's established development professionals in a social setting. The response had been immediate and enthusiastic. These executives knew my professional reputation, trusted my judgment, and were genuinely interested in expanding their networks to include quality business relationships I could recommend. As guests began arriving, I positioned myself near the entrance, greeting clients and colleagues as they entered. Each introduction followed the same pattern. Dr. Hawkins, I'm so glad you could join us tonight. I'd like you to meet my father, Callum Straven, founder of Straven Development Group. Mr. Morrison, thank you for coming. This is my dad, Callum. Straven, I thought you two might find some interesting common ground regarding commercial development strategies. Sandra, I'm delighted you're here. Dad, I'd like you to meet Sandra Walsh from Titan Development Corporation. Sandra, this is my father, Callum Straven. With each introduction, I watched Dad's understanding of my professional world deepen. These weren't just business contacts I'd mentioned casually. These were senior executives who knew my work intimately, respected my strategic insight, and treated me as a peer in sophisticated business discussions. But the real transformation became evident during the dinner conversation. When David Chen asked about my keynote address at the upcoming Regional Business Council conference, Dad listened with genuine interest rather than polite dismissal as I described my presentation on innovative strategic consulting methodologies. When Patricia Hawkins mentioned the expanded consulting relationship between Meridian Healthcare and Blackstone and Associates, Dad asked informed questions about the scope of organizational consulting services rather than assuming my work involved administrative tasks. When James Morrison from Cromwell Industries thanked me for the comprehensive partnership analysis that had helped them identify optimal collaboration opportunities, Dad acknowledged my professional expertise without surprise or condescension. The evening's highlight came during the formal toasts, when Dad stood to address the gathered executives. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, but I especially want to acknowledge my daughter, Mira. For too many years, I failed to recognize that the organizational skills, analytical thinking, and strategic insight she demonstrated at home were the same capabilities that have made her one of the most respected business consultants in our region. He paused, looking directly at me with an expression of genuine pride and respect. I'm honored to be known as Mira Straven's father, and I'm grateful that she was generous enough to share her professional relationships with someone who took far too long to appreciate what everyone else in this room already knew, that she's exceptional at what she does. The applause was warm and sustained, but more importantly, it felt authentic rather than polite. After the guests departed and we'd finished the final event coordination details, Dad and I sat alone in the empty ballroom. Mira, I have something to tell you, he said. I've decided to hire Blackstone and Associates as strategic consultants for Straven Development Group's upcoming expansion planning. Through the standard client engagement process? Absolutely. Dahlia sent me the information package, and I've reviewed your fee structure and service offerings. I want to engage your firm because you're the best strategic consultant available, not because you're my daughter. 6 months later, I was featured on the cover of Regional Business Executive magazine as Consultant of the Year, with a comprehensive profile of my professional achievements and client impact. The article mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that I was the daughter of Callum Straven from Straven Development Group. The reversal was complete. I was no longer defined by my family relationship. My family relationships were footnotes to my professional identity. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome wasn't the professional recognition or the transformed family dynamics. It was the email I received from Sarah Chen, the young consultant I'd mentored months earlier. Ms. Straven, I wanted to update you on my career progress. I followed your advice about building relationships with people who already understood my capabilities rather than trying to prove myself to those who were determined not to see me. I've been promoted to senior consultant and assigned to lead our firm's largest client engagement. More importantly, I've stopped apologizing for my expertise or qualifying my professional recommendations. Thank you for showing me that our competence doesn't require anyone else's permission to be valid. I printed that email and framed it next to my diploma, a reminder that the greatest professional satisfaction comes not from individual achievement, but from empowering others to recognize and claim their own worth. Today, when people ask about my success, I tell them this: your value isn't determined by other people's willingness to recognize it. But sometimes, to protect that value, you have to stop accepting their refusal to see it. The girl who was dismissed as just the help became the woman whose help was actively sought by the most successful organizations in the region. And the father who couldn't see his daughter's capabilities learned to introduce her as one of the most respected business professionals he knew. Because when you stop shrinking yourself to fit other people's limited expectations, you discover exactly how much space you're actually capable of filling. The help they took for granted became the influence they couldn't afford to lose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.